The town of Bitter Fork sat baking under a sun that seemed to hold a personal grudge against every living thing beneath it. Eleanor Vance stepped down from the stagecoach onto a street made of nothing but churned dust and old grievances, and the heat rose up to meet her like the breath of something enormous and unkind. She had read about the American West in the parlor back in Boston, and books with engravings that made the desert look noble and clean. Those books had lied. The real thing stank of horse manure and creosote and the sour bite of unwashed men, and the air shimmered with a heat so thick it felt like wading through warm tar. Her traveling dress, a sensible gray wool that had served her well across 2,000 miles of railway and rutted road, now clung to her back like a wet hand. She had chosen wool for respectability. Out here, respectability was a luxury that cost a body dearly. Sweat traced slow paths down her spine, and the high collar she had buttoned that morning felt like a noose drawn by a patient hangman. She set her single trunk at her feet and clasped her gloved hands before her, and she waited, because waiting was all she had been told to do. She was 26 years old, and a stranger to every face that passed her, and every face that passed her took its time. Looking, men in dust-colored hats turned their heads with the slow swivel of buzzards marking something that might soon stop moving. A woman alone in Bitter Fork was a curiosity, and a woman in city clothes was a curiosity with money, or so they reckoned, though they reckoned wrong. Eleanor had $11 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and a secret folded smaller still, tucked beneath her ribs where no thief could reach it. She kept her chin level and her eyes moving, cataloging the street the way she had once cataloged ledgers in a back room, the smell of cigar smoke and fear, the saloon on the corner, the mercantile with its sagging porch, the livery where a blacksmith hammered iron with the steady patience of a man with nowhere better to be. She noted the sheriff's office and the way two men loitered near it, who did not look like lawmen and did not look like they cared whether anyone thought so. Observation had kept her alive in Boston. She intended for it to keep her alive here in this furnace, at the edge of the world, where she had come to marry a man she had never seen. The letter had been brief, and the handwriting square and unschooled. A man named Thomas Reed had advertised for a wife through an agency that arranged such things for lonely homesteaders too far from civilization to court a woman the honest way. Eleanor had answered not for love, which she no longer believed in, nor for adventure, which she had never wanted. She had answered because a marriage and a new name 1,000 miles from Boston was the only door left unlocked to her, and behind her in that city walked men who would close every door if they found her first. So, she had become Eleanor Vance, a name as plain and forgettable as she could invent, and she had boarded a train. Now she stood in the dust and waited for Thomas Reed, who was meant to meet the noon stage. Noon came and went. The sun climbed and then began its slow surrender toward the western hills, and still no one came to claim her. The other passengers dispersed. The stage driver unhitched his team and led them away, and Eleanor Vance stood alone with her trunk and her secret, as the long shadows reached across the street like fingers. It was nearly an hour past the appointed time when a rider came down the street at an unhurried walk, and something in the way he sat his horse made Eleanor straighten without knowing why. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured a soft man, a farmer gone to seed, the kind who advertised for wives because no woman who knew him would have him. This man was carved from harder material. He sat tall in a worn saddle, and his shoulders were broad beneath a faded shirt gone the color of weak coffee. A leather vest, cracked and pale with age, hung loose upon his frame. His face was a study in shadow under the brim of a sweat-stained hat, all weathered planes, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in some days. And his eyes, when they found her, were the gray of a sky, thinking about a storm. He drew up before her and did not dismount at once. He simply looked at her, and she looked back, and the silence between them stretched taut as a wire. A horse stamped somewhere. The blacksmith's hammer rang. Eleanor did not lower her gaze, though every instinct of her upbringing screamed that she should. Out here, she sensed, lowering your eyes was how you told a man you were prey. You'd be the woman the agency sent, he said at last. It was not a question. His voice was low and rough, like a wheel turning over gravel, a voice that sounded as if it had gone unused for long stretches and had forgotten the shape of easy speech. Eleanor inclined her head. "I am Eleanor Vance," she said, and her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was told to expect Mr. Thomas Reed." Something flickered across the man's hard face, there and gone like a fish beneath dark water. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, boots striking the dust, and he stood a full head taller than she. Up close, he smelled of horse and wood smoke and sun-warmed leather, and there was a stillness about him that was somehow more unsettling than any noise. "Thomas Reed is dead," he said. "3 weeks back, fever took him. He was my brother." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her sensible shoes, though her face betrayed nothing. She had learned long ago to receive blows without flinching. "I see," she said softly. "Then I have come a very long way for nothing." The man studied her, and in his storm-gray eyes she read no cruelty and no comfort, only a weary calculation, as if she were one more hardship in a life made of them. "Name's Caleb Reed," he said. "Thomas wrote me of you before he passed. Asked me to see you settled, one way or another." He glanced at her trunk, then up the empty street, then back at her face, with an unhurried thoroughness that should have offended her and somehow did not. "There's no boarding house here fit for a woman. The hotel's a saloon with rooms above, and the men in it ain't the sort I'd leave a dog among." He paused, and she watched him wrestle with words that plainly did not come easy. "My place is a half-day's ride out. You can come there tonight, sleep safe, and we'll figure the rest come morning. Or you can stay here and take your chances." It was not gallant. It was not even kind. Exactly. It was simply the truth laid bare, and Eleanor had grown so unused to truth that it nearly undid her. She thought of the men loitering by the sheriff's office, of the way the saloon's noise had grown uglier as the day wore on. She thought of the secret beneath her ribs and the men who might already be tracing her westward, ledger by ledger, lie by lie. "The wagon," she said. "Is it far to fetch?" Caleb Reed shook his head once. "No wagon. Axles broke. We ride." Eleanor looked at the horse. An enormous animal, the color of old rust, and then at her wool skirts, and she understood that she was being tested. She did not protest. That was the thing he would remember later, when he tried to account for why he had not simply left her in the road. She did not weep or wring her hands or demand the impossible. She looked at the horse and she looked at her skirts, and then she bent and took a fistful of gray wool and tore the seam clear up to her knee with a sound like a sigh, bearing nothing improper but freeing her legs to ride. "Then we ride," she said. Caleb Reed's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch, the closest thing to surprise his weathered face seemed capable of. And something that was not quite respect but stood next door to it settled into the set of his shoulders. He lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing and lashed it behind the saddle, and then he held out one scarred brown hand to help her mount. His palm was hard as carved oak. She set her boot in the stirrup and swung up before him, sitting stiff and proper as the horse shifted beneath her, and he mounted behind, a wall of heat and muscle that did not touch her, save where it had to. He clicked his tongue, and the rust-colored horse turned its nose toward the open country, and Bitter Fork began to fall away behind them, its noise dissolving into the vast and patient silence of the land. The wilderness swallowed them slowly, the way the sea swallows a swimmer who has gone out too far. The last fence post passed. The last rutted track gave way to open range, and then there was nothing but the land, rolling away in every direction toward mountains that floated blue and unreachable on the horizon. Eleanor had never imagined a space so large could exist. In Boston, the sky with a strip of dirty light between rooftops. Here, it was an ocean turned upside down, so vast and so empty that it made her chest ache with something she could not name. The grass had gone gold and brittle with the late season, and it hissed against the horse's legs. Hawks turned in slow wheels overhead. The sun slid lower, and the light went from white to amber to a deep and bloody copper that gilded every blade of grass and every fold of the hills, and for a moment the harshness of the place was transfigured into a beauty so severe it frightened her. She felt small. She felt erased and riding before this silent stranger through a country that did not know her name and did not care whether she lived, she felt for the first time in 2 years of running almost safe. They rode a long while without speaking. Caleb Reed was not a man who filled silence for the comfort of it, and Eleanor, who had spent her life learning when to hold her tongue, found his quiet restful rather than rude. She studied what she could of him without turning her head, the way she had learned to study men in the back room of a Boston establishment whose books she had kept and whose secrets she had carried. She marked the easy economy of his movements, the way he sat the horse as though he had been born to it, the way his gray eyes never stopped moving across the land, reading it, weighing it, watching the tree lines and the draws, the way she watched the faces of dangerous men. He missed nothing. She understood that about him within the first hour, and it was both a comfort and a warning. A man who saw everything would in time see her, and what she carried, and what she had done. As the dusk came on, he reined the horse to a halt beside a thin trickle of a creek and dismounted, and without a word he unstoppered a canteen and held it up to her. "Drink," he said. "Long ride yet." She drank. The water was warm and tasted of tin, and it was the finest thing she had ever swallowed. "I'm sorry for the hardship of it," he said, and the gruff apology came out of him stiff and strange, like a tool he had not used in years and had to remember the working of wagon have been easier. "On you wasn't right. Making you ride." Eleanor lowered the canteen and looked at him in the failing light. This hard and weathered man apologizing to a stranger for a broken axle, as though it were a sin. He owned, "You owe me no apology, Mr. Reed," she said. "You owe me nothing at all. I am the stranger here, and you the only soul who has shown me a kindness since I stepped off that stage." Something moved in his face, a softening too small to name, and he looked away toward the darkening hills, as though her words had touched a place in him long left untended. He capped the canteen, he helped her back into the saddle. And as full dark came down over the country, and the stars bloomed in their countless thousands across a sky, blacker and deeper than any she had ever seen, Caleb Reed turned the horse toward a single point of light far off across the plain, a small lit window in an ocean of dark, and Eleanor Vance rode toward it carrying her secret. And the man who carried her carried his own. The homestead, when they reached it, was less than she had feared, and more than she had hoped, which was to say, it was honest. A low cabin of squared timber crouched against a rise, its single window glowing amber from a fire someone had laid against the night. A barn stood off to one side in a corral, and a smaller outbuilding she could not make out in the dark. There were no neighbors. There was no town. There was only this, a handful of human structures stubborn against the immense black emptiness of the land. And the wind came off the plain and worried at the eaves with a sound like a low and constant mourning. Eleanor's heart sank a little at the loneliness of it, and then steadied, because loneliness was the price of safety, and she had paid steeper prices for less. Caleb dismounted and lifted her down, and his hands at her waist were impersonal and certain, and he set her on her feet and stepped back at once, putting space between them as though the space were a thing he owed her. "There's the cabin," he said, nodding toward the smaller outbuilding she had not been able to see, was meant to be Thomas's before. "It's yours tonight." He carried her trunk to its door and pushed it open, and inside a small fire, already burned in a stone hearth, and a narrow bed stood made up with clean wool blankets, and on a rough table sat bread and cold meat and a jar of water beating in the firelight. He had prepared it. That was the thing that stopped her breath. Sometime in the days since his brother's death, this silent man had ridden out and laid a fire, and made a bed and set food upon a table for a woman he had never met, on the chance she might come, and the certainty she would need shelter. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at the small, warm room and felt something crack quietly in the wall she had built around her heart. "There's a bar," Caleb said, and he pointed to a heavy wooden beam set in iron brackets beside the door, dropped across from the inside. "Won't nobody come through that door you don't want coming." He said it plainly, without weight. But Eleanor understood exactly what he was telling her, and the understanding flooded through her so suddenly that she had to look away to hide her face. He was telling her she was safe. He was telling her that she alone held the key to her own door, that he laid no claim upon her, that whatever bargain his dead brother had struck with an agency 1,000 miles away, this man would not collect it. In 2 years of running from men who own things and people without conscience, no one had offered Eleanor Vance the simple sovereignty of a bar she could drop with her own hands. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out rougher than she intended. Caleb Reed touched the brim of his hat, a small, grave courtesy, and turned to go. At the threshold, he paused. "Stove will want feeding through the night," he said. "Wood stacked by the hearth. Morning comes early out here." Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark, and a moment later she heard the door of the main cabin close. Eleanor stepped inside and lowered the heavy bar into its brackets, and the sound of it dropping home was the most beautiful sound she had heard in years. She stood alone in the firelit room and let out a breath she felt she had been holding since Boston. Then she sat upon the edge of the narrow bed and reached beneath the bodice of her torn gray dress and drew out the secret she had carried 2,000 miles. It was a slim, leather book, no larger than her palm, its pages dense with her own cramped figures. The ledger, the true ledger, the one she had copied in the dead of night by candlelight, the one that named every man in the Halloran syndicate and every dirty dollar that had passed through their hands. The reason she ran, the reason she could never stop running. She held it a moment in the firelight, then hid it away again and lay down in her clothes upon the clean wool blankets and slept. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as quiet and patient as the turning of the earth. Eleanor woke each dawn to find that Caleb had already been awake for hours, his shape moving through the gray light among the animals, and she would find left upon the flat stone outside her door a small offering of his labor. A tin pail of milk, still warm. 3 brown eggs nested in straw. Once, a fistful of late wildflowers, blue and improbable, that he had clearly torn from some hidden corner of the range and left without a word, and which he pressed between the ledger's pages where no one would ever see them. He never knocked. He never lingered. He left these gifts the way a man leaves grain for a wary animal he hopes in time to gentle, and Eleanor, who had been treated as property by powerful men and as prey by hungry ones, found herself slowly undone by being treated, instead, as something worth feeding. She watched him from her window through the long, bright days. She watched him gentle a half-wild colt with a patience that seemed to have no bottom, his rough voice gone soft and low. She watched him work from dark to dark, and she watched him stand sometimes at evening, looking west toward nothing at all, his shoulders bowed under a grief she recognized because she carried its cousin. She did not stay idle. Idleness had never been her nature, and she would not begin out here, where the land respected only those who bent their backs to it. The little cabin she set to rights with a fury of purpose, scrubbing the rough floor, beating the dust from the blankets, scouring the soot from the small window, until the morning light poured through clean and golden. She found in this reclaiming of a space as her own a kind of healing she had not known she needed, for in Boston she had owned nothing, not even her name, and here within 4 timber walls she had built a small dominion that was hers alone. And she began, too, to repay him in the only currency she had, which was the work of her hands and the sharpness of her mind. She had noticed his shirts were torn and clumsily mended, the stitching of a man who had no one to do it for him. And so one evening she gathered her courage along with her needle and thread, and when she returned his milk pail she left beside it 3 of his shirts, the rents in them mended so fine the seams scarcely showed. It was not a wife's duty she performed, it was a declaration. "I am a person," the small neat stitches said. "I have worth, and I will pay my way, and I will not be beholden." Caleb found the shirts at dusk, and Eleanor watched from her clean window as he lifted one and turned it in his scarred hands, examining the work in the dying light. He stood a long moment, very still, and though she could not see his face, she saw his shoulders change, some old tension going out of them. The next morning there were 4 eggs upon her stone instead of 3, and a small wedge of honeycomb besides, sticky and amber and wild, and Eleanor understood that a conversation had begun between them that used no words at all. It was a slow language they were learning, spoken in milk and mended cloth and firewood split and stacked at her door, and a cup of water carried without being asked. Day by day, her fear of him thinned and fell away like the wool of her torn dress, and in its place grew something more dangerous, which was understanding. She began to know the rhythms of his silence. She began to read the weather of his hard gray eyes, and she began, against every law she had set herself, to feel the pull of him, this broken and honorable man, the way a lodestone feels the north, helpless and certain and afraid. It was 3 weeks before he spoke to her of the thing that lay between them. She was carrying water from the creek at dusk, the pail heavy in her hand, when she found him standing at the corral fence, and in his hand was a folded paper she recognized at once, though she had never seen it. The agreement, the marriage contract Thomas Reed had struck with the agency, the deed of her, the document that made of Eleanor Vance, a thing bought and shipped like grain. Caleb held it, and his face was carved and grim in the failing light. "You ought to see this burn," he said. He drew a match along the fence rail, and it flared, and he touched it to the corner of the paper, and they both watched the flame eat its way across the words that had bound her. "You're not property," he said, low and rough as the fire curled the paper black. "Not mine, not my brother's, not no man's. I won't hold you to a bargain you never struck with me." The ash drifted down into the dust. "You're free, Eleanor Vance, free to go where you please." He let the last burning corner fall and ground it under his boot, and then he looked at her, and his eyes held no expectation, only a flinty honesty. "But I'll say this plain," he went on. "Winter's coming on hard, and the passes'll close inside a month, and a woman alone in that country don't see spring. So I won't pretend leaving's wise. I'm only saying the choosing's yours. You stay, because you choose it. You go, I'll see you safe to the railhead, far as I'm able." Eleanor stood with the water pail dragging at her arm and felt the whole shape of her life turn upon its hinge. She had not been given a choice in years. Every road she had walked had been the only road, every door the only door. And now this man had handed her the one thing the syndicate had stolen from her, which was the freedom to decide her own course. "I have nowhere to go," she said quietly, and it was true. And it was also not the whole of why she stayed. "And I find I do not wish to." Caleb Reed nodded once, slow, and looked away west, and neither of them spoke of it again, but something had changed, and they both knew it. The reckoning came on a morning, the color of slate. Eleanor was at the creek when she saw the dust, a thin smudge rising on the southern horizon where no honest traveler had business been, and her blood went to ice in her veins. She knew that dust. She had been waiting for it in the deep secret part of her since the day she fled Boston with a stolen ledger and a syndicate's fury at her heels. She dropped the pail and ran for the cabins, her torn skirts whipping, and Caleb met her in the yard with a question already hard in his eyes, for he had seen it too. "Riders," she gasped, "coming fast, 4, maybe 5. She had meant to lie to him forever, to carry her secret to whatever grave this country dug for her. But there was no time left for lies, and he had earned the truth. And so she gave it to him in a rush. "They're after me, Caleb. After a thing I took. I worked the books for a man named Outrun in Boston, kept the accounts of every crime he ever committed, and when I learned what manner of man he was, I copied the true ledger, and I ran. They've hunted me ever since. I should have told you. I brought this down on you. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm sorry." Caleb Reed did not waste a breath on blame. That was the measure of him, and she loved him for it in the space of a single heartbeat. His face went still and cold and certain, the face of a man stepping into deep and familiar water, and he turned and strode for the cabin. "Get inside," he said, and it was not unkind, only absolute bar. "The door behind us." Within those walls, he moved with a terrible economy, lifting a long rifle from its pegs above the hearth, drawing a second from a chest, laying out boxes of cartridges in neat rows upon the table as though setting a meal. There was no fear in him that she could see, only a grim and dreadful competence, and Eleanor understood with a cold clarity that this stoic homesteader had been in some buried chapter of his life, a far more dangerous man than the land let on. How many guns can you work? He asked, not looking up. And Eleanor Vance, who had let him believe her soft, who had played the delicate outsider since the moment she stepped off the stage, walked to the table and lifted the second rifle and worked the action with a smooth and practiced certainty that snapped his gray eyes up to her face. I can work this one, she said. He looked at her, then truly looked, and what passed between them in that instant was the final falling of every wall. He had been hiding behind silence, and she behind frailty. And now, in the face of death, they stood revealed to each other, two people far stronger and far more broken than either had let the other see. My father taught me to shoot before he died, she said. Halloran's men taught me why I'd need to. Caleb almost smiled, a grim ghost of the expression. Then we'll make a fight of it, he said. He stationed her at the rear window with a clear field across the corral, and he took the front, and they waited as the dust resolved into riders, 5 of them. Hard men in long coats with rifles across their saddle bows, fanning out as they came in the manner of men who had done this kind of work before. The lead rider drew up at the edge of the yard, and a voice carried thin across the cold air, oily and confident. Reed Homestead, we got no quarrel with you, only with the woman you're harboring. Send her out, and we ride on. She's a thief, friend. Wanted back east, and there's good money for the man who don't make trouble. Caleb Reed answered with the rifle. His first shot took the lead rider's hat clean off and put the man flat in the dust, scrambling. And then the morning came apart in a roar of powder and splintering wood. Eleanor pressed herself to the rear window and felt the old cold stillness descend over her, the stillness she had hidden from him, and when a rider broke from cover to flank the barn, she led him a breath the way her father had taught her and fired, and the man pitched from his saddle and did not rise. There was no horror in her only purpose. The horror would come later in the night, in the years they fought as though they had fought side by side 100 times. She called the riders she saw, low and clear, and he called his, and they moved through the smoke-filled cabin, anticipating each other without a word, his reload covering her shot, her eyes watching the windows. He could not. The hard men outside had not reckoned on 2 guns, and they had not reckoned on these 2, and one by one, the syndicate's hunters fell or fled, until the yard lay quiet save for the wind and the moan of a wounded horse and the ringing in their ears. 3 lay dead in the dust, and 2 had broken for the southern horizon, flogging their mounts toward whatever distant master had sent them, and Caleb Reed lowered his rifle and let out a long, slow breath. There was blood on his sleeve, where a splinter or a ball had caught him, a shallow red furrow he seemed not to notice. And Eleanor crossed the room and took his arm and bound it with the strip torn from her petticoat, her hand steady, though her heart slammed against her ribs. For a long while, neither spoke. The powder smoke hung blue in the shafts of slate-gray light, and the smell of it lay thick over everything. And outside, the wind picked up, and the first hard flakes of the coming winter began to fall, white and silent, settling over the dead and the living without distinction. They'll send more, Eleanor said at last, her voice gone hollow. Halloran doesn't quit. He can't. Not while that book exists. Caleb looked down at her, and his hard face had softened into something she had never seen there, an open and unguarded thing. Let them come, he said simply. They'll find the same. They sat together by the hearth as the snow thickened beyond the window, and there, in the warm flickering dark, with death lying cold in the yard, Caleb Reed gave her at last the thing she had given him, which was the truth of his own wound. Had a wife, he said, staring into the fire. The words dredged up slow from a deep and silted place. Sarah, years back, fever came through, like the one took Thomas. There weren't no doctor inside 100 miles, and I rode for one. And I rode hard, and I came back too late. His jaw worked, held her while she went, buried her up on the rise where the cabin looks west, so she'd have the sunset. He fell silent a moment, swore off it. After people caring, figured a man. Can't lose what he don't let himself have. Lived out here alone, these 8 years, and called it peace. He turned and looked at her, and the firelight caught the wet shine in his storm-gray eyes. Wasn't peace, was just slow dying. Didn't know it till you stepped off that stage and tore your skirt and looked at me like you'd be damned. Before you'd flinch, Eleanor felt the last hard knot in her chest come loose. She had armored herself for so long against the syndicate and against the world and against the possibility of being known. And now this silent and honorable man had laid his oldest wound bare to ease her own, and she found she could not hold herself apart from him any longer. She told him then the rest of it, the whole bitter shape of her life, the father who taught her sums and marksmanship in equal measure, the slow descent into Halloran's account books, the moment she understood the blood behind every figure she balanced, the long terror of the road. He listened without judgment, the way he did everything. And when she had finished, he reached out one scarred brown hand and laid it over hers upon the rough wood. And the touch of it was the first tenderness she had permitted herself in 2,000 miles. Outside, the snow came down and walled the world in white, sealing the passes, sealing them in together, and what should have been a prison felt instead like a shelter, the only true one she had ever known. The winter that closed over the homestead changed everything between them, gently and entirely. Eleanor did not return to the little cabin with the bar across its door. There was no spoken decision, no declaration. One evening, she simply remained in the warmth of the main house as the storm howled, and Caleb cleared a place for her things, and her presence flowed into his solitary world, the way spring water flows into a dry creek bed, filling the empty places he had long since stopped noticing were empty. The two separate lives they had guarded, so fiercely merged into one household, one fire, one shared and silent watch against the dark. He taught her the work of the land in the long shut-in days, how to read the sky for weather, how to doctor a colicky horse, how to set a trap line against the deep snow. And she taught him things too, brought small, civilizing graces into his Spartan world. Until the cabin that had been a bachelor's cold barracks took on the warmth of a place where two people had chosen to live rather than merely survive. They became, without ever once using the word, partners. The mended shirts and the carried water, that had been their cautious early language, deepened into a fuller speech, into comfortable silences before the fire and the easy passing of tools between practiced hands and the thousand small kindnesses that are the true grammar of a shared life. The hunters did not return that winter. The snows that trapped Eleanor trapped her enemies out, and in the white stillness she and Caleb forged a thing the syndicate could never reach. She no longer kept the ledger hidden beneath her ribs. She kept it openly now, in a box upon the mantel. No longer a secret she carried alone, but a danger they would face together. And somehow, the sharing of its weight made it light enough to bear. In the spring, they agreed they would ride to the territorial marshal at the fort, 2 valleys over, an honest man Caleb knew of, and they would put that book of crimes into hands that could end Halloran for good. But spring was far off, and the snow was deep, and there was no hurry now in anything they did. It was deep in that first winter, on a night when the wind had finally gone, still and the stars burned hard and clear over a world made silver with snow, that Caleb Reed said the thing that stood for all the things he could not say. They were sitting close before the dying fire, her head against his shoulder, his rough hand idle in her dark hair, and he was quiet a long while, in the way she had come to know, meant he was working up to something costly. Place was dead before you came, he said at last, the gravel of his voice gone soft and low. 8 years I lived here and never once heard a sound in it but my own. Then you came, with your torn dress and your secrets and your needle, and somehow the whole of it came back to living. He turned and looked down at her, and his hard-weathered face held no guard at all now, only a plain and aching wonder. Don't rightly know how to say a thing like this, never had the words for it, but you brought me back from the dead, Eleanor Vance, and I mean to spend whatever's left of me being worthy of it. Outside, the great silence of the frozen land held its breath, and inside by the embers, Eleanor lifted her face to his and answered him at last in the only language that needed no words, and the long winter closed warm and unafraid around the two of them, no longer outsiders, no longer alone, but home.